Daniel slid the bank statement across the dinner table like he was handing me a verdict. His mother, Patricia, sat beside him with her hands folded, wearing that tight little smile she wore whenever she thought she had already won. "We're almost broke," Daniel said. "Too calm." "The kind of calm that takes practice," Patricia added. "The lake house needs to go." I stared at the numbers. My retirement fund, nearly wiped out. Our savings, almost gone. Daniel sighed and said he had been shielding me from the stress because I simply didn't understand investments. I felt humiliated, managed, reduced to nothing after 32 years of marriage. Then he said it plainly. "I'll handle the sale." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a discussion. This was a decision already made. And I had never been meant to question it. I sat there nodding, my heart racing beneath a calm face. But before I go further, my name is Carol. I'm 58 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. If stories like mine speak to something real in your life, please subscribe to this channel. What happens next will change the way you see everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. Daniel dozed off quickly, the way people do when they've already made a decision and feel at peace with it. I lay in the dark replaying every word from dinner. The numbers on that statement. Patricia's smile. The ease in Daniel's voice. Something didn't add up. We had lived comfortably for years. Daniel ran a consulting firm. I managed our home, raised our children, handled every expense with care. We weren't rich, but we were never struggling. At least, I had never thought we were. Around midnight, I got up for water. I passed Daniel's study and noticed his laptop sitting open on the desk. I only meant to use it to look up a recipe, something normal, something safe. But then I saw it. A folder on his desktop I had never noticed. Whitmore Holdings LLC. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the mouse. But some quiet voice in my chest told me to click. Inside were investment statements. 6-figure deposits. Quarterly transfers. And listed as primary beneficiary was one name. Patricia. Not mine. His mother's. My heart pounded so hard I had to sit down. If we were broke, why was money flowing somewhere I had never heard of? I didn't say a word to Daniel. Not that night. Not the next morning when he kissed my cheek and left with his coffee thermos. Not when Patricia called that afternoon to chat, as if nothing was wrong. I had understood something important. Confronting Daniel too soon would push him to hide whatever he hadn't hidden yet. He would move things. Cover tracks. I couldn't afford that.
So I made a phone call instead.
I found a financial advisor named Frank through a quiet recommendation from my doctor's wife. I called his office the very next morning and made an appointment for that afternoon. I asked him for a legal asset search tied to my name and social security number. I said I simply wanted to understand where we stood. He was professional. He asked few questions. 3 days later, his results arrived. There were loans connected to my name. Lines of credit pulled against our home equity, accounts I had never knowingly opened, recorded as jointly consented. Daniel hadn't exactly stolen in the way most people picture it. He had rearranged everything quietly, using our shared finances like pieces in a puzzle only he could see. And he had never once shown me the full picture. I started paying much closer attention after that. 2 days after Frank's report arrived, I was standing in the kitchen when I heard Patricia's voice drifting clearly from Daniel's study. The door wasn't fully closed. I set down the cup in my hand. I stood very still and listened. "You cannot let her control the assets, Daniel. She's too emotional." Too emotional. I pressed my back against the wall and let those words settle. 32 years of marriage. 3 children raised and launched. Countless household decisions made quietly, without fanfare, without a single word of credit from anyone. And Patricia had neatly folded all of that into just 2 words. That evening, Daniel found me in the living room. He sat beside me, patted my hand gently, and told me not to worry about money. "It's complicated stuff," he said. "I'll take care of it." I looked at him. The same man I had chosen at 26 years old. The man I had trusted completely with everything. I nodded the way I always did. But this time was different. This time, while I smiled and said, "Okay, Daniel, I was already writing a careful, private list in my mind of everything I needed to find out, and I intended to find out every single bit of it. I went to the attic the following Saturday morning while Daniel played golf. He played every Saturday without fail, which gave me 4 uninterrupted hours. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Somewhere in those stacked boxes was my father's estate binder, a thick green folder he had pressed into my hands the year before he passed. "Keep this safe, Carol," he had told me. "Read it when you need to." I had tucked it away, without reading it carefully. Daniel had told me early on that the trust my father set up was basically empty after taxes. He said it with such confidence that I believed him completely. I found the binder under a box of Christmas ornaments. I carried it downstairs, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table. Then I read every single page.
Slowly, carefully.
And I froze. I was the sole trustee of my father's family trust. Not Daniel. Not Patricia. Me alone. And the lake house, the property Daniel had been quietly arranging to sell, was held inside that protected trust. It could not be sold, listed, or transferred without my written authorization. Daniel didn't just want to sell the lake house. He legally could not.
Not without me.
I put the binder somewhere safe, not the attic. I kept it in my car, tucked inside a canvas tote bag beneath my gym shoes. Then I played my part. That evening, I asked Daniel casually how the lake house sale was coming along. I kept my voice light and easy, no weight behind the words at all. He said the paperwork was almost ready. He had already been working with a realtor, and things were moving ahead quickly. That told me everything I needed. He was actively arranging a sale he had no legal right to complete, and doing it without telling me the truth about why we supposedly needed the money at all. I didn't push back.
I didn't react.
I smiled warmly and said, "That sounds good." Then the very next morning, I called the realtor's office directly. I introduced myself as Carol, Daniel's wife, and said I'd like to schedule a meeting at her earliest convenience. The receptionist was warm and friendly. She assumed, naturally, that I already knew about everything that had been discussed. I thanked her and hung up. Then I opened my notebook and wrote one single word at the very top of the page. Ready. The realtor's name was Karen. She greeted me at her office door with a wide smile and a firm handshake. "Mrs. Carroll, I'm so glad you came in," she said cheerfully. "I think you'll be very pleased with the timeline Daniel and I have been working out." I thanked her and sat down. Then I said calmly and clearly that the lake house was held inside a protected family trust, and that I was the sole trustee of that trust. Karen's smile faded slowly, like a light being dimmed. She opened her laptop and pulled up the county property records. Her expression grew more serious with every passing second. The records confirmed what I already knew. The lake house was trust property. Daniel's name did not appear on the trust documents. He had no legal authority to list, market, or sign anything on the property without my explicit written consent. Karen closed her laptop quietly. She thanked me for coming in, apologized for the confusion, and said she would need to withdraw from the listing immediately. That evening, Daniel received her email on his phone. I was standing at the kitchen stove when I heard him murmur from across the room, "Why would she back out?" I kept stirring the pot and said nothing at all. While Daniel puzzled over Karen's withdrawal, Frank was finishing his deeper analysis. I had given him photographs I'd quietly taken on my phone the night I found the Whitmore Holdings folder on Daniel's laptop. He had been working through everything carefully and methodically for the past several days. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon while Daniel was still at his office. "Carol," Frank said carefully, "Whitmore Holdings is not struggling." I had suspected this already, but hearing it said plainly out loud still sent a chill through me. Frank explained the company had been operating quietly and profitably for years, accumulating a substantial amount. But portions of the funding used to build it had come from redirected marital assets, money that had moved out of our joint accounts in small, regular amounts over time. Nothing technically criminal. No outright forgeries or stolen bank funds. But deeply, deliberately deceptive. And Patricia's name was woven through the entire structure. She had advised on how the company was set up and helped position the assets to limit my legal claim if Daniel and I ever separated. This was not mismanagement. This was a strategy. And it had been running for years, quietly, right beneath my feet. Daniel confronted me 3 days later. He had been watching me more closely since Karen withdrew from the listing. I could feel it, the way his eyes tracked me when I moved through the house, the way conversations stopped when I walked into a room. That evening he stood in the kitchen doorway and asked me directly, "Did you contact the realtor?" I turned and looked at him evenly. "I'm just learning more about our finances," I said. His jaw tightened. He told me I was being paranoid, inventing problems where there were none. He had been working hard to protect us both, and this was how I repaid that effort. I didn't argue with a single word of it. An hour later, Patricia arrived at the house unannounced. She swept into the living room, settled into her usual armchair, and told me in a carefully controlled voice that I was creating instability in the family. Daniel was under real stress. I was making everything far harder than it needed to be. A good wife trusted her husband's judgment completely. I sat across from her and listened to every word without interrupting. And somewhere during that conversation, something inside me changed. A door closed quietly on the version of myself that had always stepped back and trusted without question. I was done being quiet. The next morning, I drove to the office of an estate attorney named Barbara. Frank had recommended her. She specialized in trust law and marital asset disputes. Her office was tidy and organized, the kind of space that made you feel like the right people were in charge. I laid everything across her desk. The trust binder, Frank's report, photographs of the Whitmore Holdings documents, the loan records tied to my name, every piece of paper I had gathered. Barbara listened without interrupting once. She took careful notes. When I finished, she set her pen down. "The trust is solid," she said. "Your father drafted it well. The lake house is fully protected. Daniel has no legal authority to sell it without your written authorization." Then she said the second thing. "If marital funds were redirected into a structure designed to reduce your share in a separation, that gives you significant leverage." She said the word deliberately. Leverage. Not revenge. Not punishment. Leverage. I turned it over in my mind the way you hold something to check its weight. Leverage changes power. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt the power beginning to shift. Our 33rd anniversary fell on a Saturday evening in October. Daniel had arranged dinner at his cousin's home. About 15 people, mostly family. I wore my blue dress. I smiled. I made pleasant conversation. I had become very good at performing normal. An hour in, Patricia stood and raised her glass. She gave a gracious little speech about Daniel, how hard he worked, how much he carried, how fortunate the family was to have a man who handled everything. Then she said he deserved credit for carrying the financial burden completely alone. Guests nodded. Someone said, "Hear, hear." Glasses clinked warmly. I set my wine glass down, and I stood up. I kept my voice warm and unhurried, the way you speak when offering a small friendly correction among people you've known for years. "I actually spent some time this week reviewing our holdings," I said pleasantly. "It's been very educational." The table went quiet. Patricia's glass stopped halfway to her lips. Daniel's fork stopped midair above his plate. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to smile or stay still. I sat back down calmly and picked up my fork. The dinner continued, but something in that room had shifted permanently. Daniel found me near the coat rack before we left. He was still smiling for nearby guests, but his eyes were not smiling at all. He guided me gently into the hallway. "You embarrass me tonight," he whispered. His voice was low and controlled, but I could hear the heat underneath it. I looked at him calmly. "You embarrassed yourself," I said. He shook his head and drew a slow breath. He told me he had only ever been trying to protect me, that I didn't understand the complexity of what he was managing. He said he had carried enormous financial stress for years without complaint, all for the good of our family. I waited until he finished. Then I asked one quiet question. Why is your mother listed as the primary beneficiary of Whitmore Holdings, Daniel? The hallway fell still. Muffled voices drifted from the dining room behind us, glasses clinking, someone laughing at a joke. Daniel opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He searched for something to say, an explanation, a redirection, any version that would still hold together. Nothing came. He turned away first. That was the first real crack. The first moment I watched his carefully built confidence begin to crumble from the inside. Barbara called me the following Monday with news I hadn't expected. She had gone deeper into the Whitmore Holdings structure, tracing how it was formed, which funds had been used, and how ownership was arranged. What she found was precise and deeply unsettling. The company had been built using a combination of outside capital and redirected marital assets. The individual amounts weren't catastrophic, but the structure told a story all its own. It had been specifically designed to minimize my legal claim in the event of a divorce. Not by accident. Not through oversight. The operating agreement contained clauses buried in its language that would legally reduce what I was entitled to if Daniel and I ever separated. Details that most people would never think to look for unless they knew exactly where to search. Barbara was clear. This kind of arrangement doesn't happen casually. It requires intentional planning and someone with real knowledge of asset protection law. Patricia had worked as a financial consultant for decades before retiring. Daniel had not been reacting to the distant possibility of divorce. He had been quietly, methodically preparing for it. He hadn't just lied to me about our finances. He had drawn up a plan for a life without me. And he had started long before I ever suspected a thing. Patricia showed up at my front door 2 days later. She didn't call ahead. She never did when she wanted the advantage of surprise. She appeared dressed neatly, carrying the controlled expression she used whenever she believed she had the upper hand. I invited her inside. I made 2 cups of tea. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me, in a composed voice, that I was about to make a very serious mistake. She said that if I kept pushing, kept digging, kept questioning, I would lose everything. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she said. I wrapped both hands around my cup. Then I slid a single document across the table toward her. It was 1 page from my father's trust binder, the clause that described in clear legal language exactly what would happen to the lake house and all trust assets in any legal separation involving the sole trustee. Patricia read it once. Then again. I watched her face change across the table. The superiority drained slowly from her expression, replaced by something more calculating and careful. She had told me I would lose everything if I pushed further. But she had just realized she had miscalculated. I filed a formal request for marital asset disclosure the following week. Barbara explained the process carefully. Once submitted, Daniel was legally required to produce a complete accounting of all assets connected to our marriage, every account, every holding, every debt. He could no longer choose what I was allowed to see. Everything would have to surface. I signed the paperwork on a Thursday afternoon. Barbara submitted it that same evening. Daniel called me 2 hours later. He rarely called during the day. When I picked up, I could hear it immediately. That tightness in a person's voice when something they believed was safely tucked away has suddenly been exposed. He asked why I had filed the disclosure. I told him I simply wanted a clear picture of our finances. I kept my voice pleasant and level. He said this was entirely unnecessary, that we were 2 adults who had always handled things privately and there was no reason to involve outside processes in our marriage. I said calmly that having everything properly documented seemed sensible for both of us. There was a long pause. Then he said he would be home early. I thanked him and said I'd have dinner ready. He knew. I knew. He was no longer controlling the narrative. For the first time in 32 years, the terms were mine. Our 3 children came home the following weekend. Thomas drove up from Atlanta. Our daughter Ren flew in from Portland. Elliot, who lived nearby, arrived Friday evening carrying a bottle of wine and the cautious expression he wore whenever he sensed trouble in the family. Daniel had called each of them separately the week before. I knew because Ren mentioned it without thinking, then caught herself. He had told them I was overreacting to normal financial decisions, a confused, emotional wife who had convinced herself something was wrong. I didn't argue his version. After dinner, I laid printed copies of Frank's full report in front of each of them, bank statements, transfer records, a clear summary of the Whitmore Holdings structure and its provisions. Organized, factual, plain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't ask anyone to choose a side. I simply let them read. The room was quiet for a long time. Thomas set his papers down first and looked at Daniel across the table. Wren folded her hands and stared at the statements. Elliot looked at the floor. I watched three adults I had raised process the gap between what their father had told them and what the documents were showing them. The loyalty in that room shifted quietly, but completely. That night was the hardest. After the children had gone to their rooms and the house went still, Daniel came to find me in the sunroom. I was sitting in my chair by the dark window, looking out at the backyard. He stood in the doorway. Then he came inside and sat across from me. Neither of us spoke for a long while. Then the mask he had been holding in place for months, the calm, measured, I know best expression he had worn through all of it, finally slipped. I did it because you never understood money. The words burst out, sudden and raw. You never wanted to be involved. You never asked questions. I was the one managing everything. Every decision, every worry, every difficult call, and you just let me handle it. 32 years compressed into one accusation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I had done my crying in private, alone in my car in the early mornings before he woke up. That was finished. I looked at him steadily across the dark room. You never gave me the chance, I said. 7 quiet words. But they landed exactly where they needed to. He had no answer. He sat there in the dark, and for the first time, he looked like a man who truly understood what he had lost. Barbara presented our formal offer through legal channels exactly 1 week later. It was not dramatic. It was professional and precise. 3 clear terms. First, full financial transparency going forward. Every account, every holding, every decision made jointly and documented openly. Second, equal control over all marital assets, effective immediately. Third, Patricia formally removed from beneficiary status on all accounts tied to our shared finances. In exchange, I would not pursue a formal legal separation accompanied by a public financial misconduct review. If Daniel declined, we would move forward with complete legal separation. Every account examined. Every transfer traced. Whitmore Holdings opened to full court review. The redirected marital assets, part of the official record. The choice was his. Barbara told me his attorney called her within 2 hours of receiving the offer. She said he had sounded carefully measured, but clearly rattled underneath. I understood why. For the entire length of our marriage, Daniel had operated from assumed control. He had made decisions. He had managed information. He had decided what I needed to know and when. This was the first time in 32 years that someone else was holding the pen. And he had no comfortable way out. Patricia was furious. I didn't hear this from her directly. I heard it from Wren, who had stopped by Daniel's office to help him organize some files and called me that evening with an uncertain tone. Grandma was there today, Mom, Wren said carefully. She was telling Dad to fight. Said you had no real ground to stand on. Said you were bluffing. I thanked Wren and told her not to worry. But I understood exactly what Patricia was doing. She had helped design the Whitmore Holdings structure. She was listed as its primary beneficiary. She had helped position the assets to limit my claim in any separation. A formal legal process would bring all of that into the light. More importantly, Barbara had confirmed this specifically. The family trust clause contained a provision that mattered greatly. If the trust assets became part of court proceedings during a legal separation, the court would examine Patricia's role as a third party who had helped structure marital assets. Her position as beneficiary wouldn't just be challenged. It would almost certainly be removed by a judge entirely. Patricia had spent years maneuvering herself into financial influence. She pushed Daniel to fight. But in fighting, she stood to lose the very thing she had worked longest to protect. She had pushed too far. Now she was completely exposed. The forensic review Frank completed in the 3rd week of November contained something no one had expected. Barbara called me on a Wednesday afternoon, her voice steady as always, but with something careful underneath, like someone trying not to get ahead of the facts. "Carol," she said, "we need to meet today if possible." I was at her office within the hour. A single document sat waiting on her desk. She slid it toward me without build-up. It was a valuation report on a long-term investment my father had placed inside the family trust more than 20 years ago. At the time, it had been a modest amount, the kind a careful, quiet man sets aside and lets sit while life continues forward. But it had been growing the entire time.
Steadily. Silently.
The current valuation showed it was worth substantially more than Whitmore Holdings. More than any single asset Daniel had ever managed on his own. I read the number twice. Then I sat very still. Daniel had told me the trust was basically empty after taxes. He'd said it with complete confidence, the way he said most things, as though certainty alone made it true. He had never actually read my father's trust documents carefully. He had simply assumed, and he had looked right past the most valuable thing we had. I brought the valuation report to Daniel that same evening. I didn't build toward it dramatically. I walked into the study where he was sitting, set the document beside his laptop, and said simply, "Frank completed the full forensic review today. I thought you should see this." He picked it up and began reading. I stood near the doorway and watched his face as he moved through the pages. The defensive posture he had carried for weeks, shoulders slightly raised, expression slightly guarded, always ready to redirect, began to change. By the time he reached the valuation figure on the third page, the color had left his face entirely. He set the paper down.
He looked up at me.
For a long moment he said nothing. I could see him doing what he always did, searching for the angle, the way to reframe what he was seeing into something he could manage and control. But there was no angle here. The numbers were exactly what they were. The lake house was not the valuable asset he had been arranging to sell. The trust itself was. He had spent years positioning himself as the one who understood, the indispensable man managing things I supposedly could not grasp. He had looked directly past the most valuable thing we owned, because it had always been mine alone. December arrived with its first real cold, and with it, a family gathering at Thomas's house. I almost didn't go, but I knew Patricia would be there, and something in me needed to close a particular chapter in person. She held court at the table the way she always did at family occasions, steering conversations, telling the right stories, positioning herself at the center. Daniel sat quietly beside her. He had been very quiet since I showed him the valuation. About an hour in, Patricia began talking about the lake house. She mentioned casually to Thomas's wife that the family had been giving thought to how best to utilize the property going forward. I waited until the table had settled into a natural pause. Then I said, gently and plainly, that I was the sole trustee of a multi-million-dollar family trust, and that the lake house, along with every asset inside it, fell entirely and exclusively under my authority. I said it the way you might share pleasant holiday news. No edge. No heat. Simply information. The table went very still. Patricia opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She looked at me across the room full of shared family, and for the first time in 30 years, she had absolutely nothing to say. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. Daniel came to find me 2 weeks before Christmas. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and asked if we could work it out. He said he was open to the transparency I'd asked for. He understood things needed to change. He wanted to talk about rebuilding what we had. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked one question. Why now, Daniel? He paused. He said because he loved me. Because 32 years meant something real. Because he believed in our marriage. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the years that had genuinely been good. The children we raised, the home we filled with life, the seasons when we were truly partners. All of that was real. I didn't pretend otherwise. But love is not the same thing as trust. And what I needed was not reassurance. It was accountability. I told him quietly that transparency was not something I was asking for as a favor. It was a requirement. Not because I wanted to cause pain, but because I had finally, after 32 years, learned exactly what I was worth. And I was no longer willing to accept any arrangement that asked me to be less than that. I made my decision in January, not in anger. There was grief in it, real, quiet grief for the years that had been good. But the decision itself was made clearly and deliberately, the way I had learned to make every important choice over the preceding months. I chose separation. Barbara filed the paperwork on a cold Tuesday morning. I signed my name at the bottom of each document and felt no great drama in the moment, only a steady, quiet clarity, like a window being cleaned. The terms were straightforward. The family trust remained entirely mine. The lake house, the trust investments, every asset my father had placed inside that protected structure, safe and untouched, under my sole authority as trustee. Exactly as he had intended. Whitmore Holdings was subject to formal division. The redirected marital assets were properly accounted for and split according to law. Barbara and Daniel's attorney worked through the numbers over 3 careful weeks. Patricia's name was formally removed from all accounts tied to our marital finances. Daniel moved out in February. He didn't fight it with the foresight half expected. Perhaps he'd simply run out of angles. I thanked him sincerely for the parts of our life together that had been genuinely good. I meant every single word. Then I closed the door. By summer, I had settled into something I hadn't felt in a very long time.
Peace.
The lake house sat at the edge of the water the way it always had, quiet in the mornings, golden in the evenings, unchanged by everything that had happened around it. My father had built a small porch facing the water. I sat there each morning with my coffee, listening to the birds. My grandchildren visited in July. They ran through the same grass I had run through as a child. They fished off the same dock my father built decades before I was born. In the evenings, we cooked dinner together and watched the light disappear slowly over the water. Daniel had downsized to an apartment across town. Patricia no longer held any influence over the finances that had once given her power. Whitmore Holdings had been properly divided. The chapter built on quiet deception was officially and permanently closed. I was not a woman who had been bad with money. I was a woman who had been deliberately kept away from it, managed by people who needed my trust far more than they had ever deserved it. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. And the document that blew everyone away, my father's thick green binder, didn't just expose a lie. It proved the real power had been mine all along. I simply hadn't known where to look.